1755, Massachusetts. The horrific rituals of the Bradford family. Wealth is power. The bitter winter night cut through the barren fields of Concord like the sigh of a weary land, carrying with it the biting chill of a frozen faith. Inside the attic room of the Bradford estate, Mercy Hale shivered, the flickering oil lamp casting her small shadow onto the cold stone walls. On the floor, hardened droplets of candle wax looked like petrified tears as she hastily wrote in the journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the hearth. Below, the massive stone house of the Bradford family was shrouded in silence, a fortress of wealth and prestige built on a foundation of rotten secrets. Its dark windows were like empty eyes, guarding the sins concealed within. To the community of Concord, the Bradfords were spiritual pillars, patrons of the church. But to Mercy, the one 5-year-old servant girl, this place was a prison. Her mind still reeled from the images of the sacred prayer session a few hours earlier. The damp basement, bathed in the eerie light of candles and the thick scent of incense. The voice of Deacon Jacob Bradford, reciting twisted verses of the Bible, turning the word of God into a justification for greed. And the hands of Ruth Bradford, his fanatical sister, guiding her to lie down on the cold stone floor, her body turned into a sacrifice for their prosperity. Your purity is a gift offered to the Lord, so that he may bless this family. Ruth's voice still haunted her, each word a chain binding her soul. She had been forced to participate in such rituals since she began working here, a helpless orphan, manipulated into believing her sacrifice was holy. But tonight, something inside her had shattered. She heard the faint, muffled sobs of another girl, a new victim who had been kidnapped, being held in a locked room nearby. It was not the cry of one who was chosen, but the cry of a tormented soul. Mercy's fear had turned into a cold determination. She could not run, but she could fight. Silently, she took out a small embroidered cloth, her mother's last memento, a secret sign her mother had once used to communicate with her close friend, the widow Mary Prescott. She carefully tucked the cloth between the pages of an old holy book that was waiting to be repaired downstairs. It was a faint glimmer of hope, a plea for help sent into the darkness, hoping it would reach the hands of someone who could see through the Bradford family's mask of piety. A few weeks later, Thomas Carver, a bookbinder from Boston, arrived in Concord to repair the church's old, worn holy books, a job sponsored by the Bradford family themselves. While meticulously turning each brittle page, a small embroidered cloth fell out. Curious, Thomas picked it up. On it were crudely embroidered characters, an early form of code he had seen before. With the mind of a free thinker, skeptical of blind dogma, he quickly deciphered the message, "Help me, basement, Bradford." Thomas's blood ran cold. He had heard the whispers about the Bradford family, about their unusual wealth, about the young servant girls who often disappeared without a trace after a short time. But whispers were one thing. This desperate message was something else entirely. He decided to seek out the widow Mary Prescott, a wealthy but reclusive woman, the only person in town who seemed to keep her distance from the powerful Bradford family. When she saw the cloth, Mary's face turned pale. She recognized the sign of her late friend, Mercy's mother. "She died suddenly," she whispered, her eyes distant. "They said it was illness, but I never believed it. Before that, she had tried to warn me about something dark in that house." Without a moment's hesitation, she looked Thomas straight in the eye. "Young man, we must help the girl." She knew the Bradfords controlled both the church council and the local militia, but the proof of evil written on this cloth overcame all fear. Meanwhile, back at the Bradford estate, Deacon Jacob stood in his study, staring at the latest financial records. The profits from a recently completed land deal, a blessing that had arrived right after the latest ritual. His stern face, marked by years of warped devotion, showed nothing but cold satisfaction. Around him, ledgers were neatly stacked, recording the family's legacy of prosperity. "I hear young Mercy has been rather stubborn lately." Ruth, his sister, entered, her voice both sycophantic and domineering. "She's starting to ask questions. That is a sign of impurity." Jacob nodded, pleased by his sister's obedience. "Her purity is waning, but do not worry. I have found a new sacrifice." He smiled, a smile that sent a shiver down the spine. "A vagrant child from the next town over. No one will miss her." "And what of us, Father?" asked Samuel, The second son at 20, as he entered the room, his eyes gleamed with fanaticism, the mark of one who fully believed his father's dogma and was eager to participate to protect the family's prosperity. "The next ritual will be when Jonathan participates," Jacob declared. "It is time for him to shoulder his responsibility. Our prosperity must not be interrupted. Tonight, we will prepare for the next offering." As the discussion about the ritual concluded, the Bradford family members returned to their daily routines, putting on an impeccable performance of piety and order. They were completely unaware that a man was watching from a distance, his heart filled with indignation. It was Jonah, the family's former hired hand, who was pruning trees in the nearby church cemetery. Jonah had accidentally overheard the anxious conversation between Thomas Carver and the widow Mary Prescott. He recognized the embroidered cloth they were passing between them, as he had seen Mercy's mother make it. Unjustly fired for simply daring to ask about the disappearance of a previous servant girl, Jonah's suspicion of the Bradford family had been simmering for a long time. He knew about the always locked doors, the muffled cries in the night, and the eerie silence that fell over the house whenever a new financial blessing arrived. What Jonah had just heard confirmed his worst fears. He decided he could no longer remain silent. More importantly, he knew something no one else did. A secret entrance that led directly to the basement, a legacy from the time the house was built that was only passed down among the long-serving hired hands. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Mercy found Jonathan sitting alone in the library, his face tormented after hearing his father's decision. "You know it's wrong," Mercy whispered, her voice pleading. "You don't believe our family's prosperity comes from harming others." Jonathan didn't answer, but his silence was an answer in itself. He feared his father, feared losing his status and inheritance, but his conscience was screaming. Mercy saw a glimmer of hope. "Help me," she said. "Just help me gather proof. The notes your father writes, the records of the land deals after each ritual." The stage was set for a confrontation between truth and greed, between courage and the terrible power of a silence protected by faith. In the distance, the church bells began to toll, their bronze voices carrying across Concord like a warning of a reckoning that was quietly approaching. Evil could flourish in the darkness, but it could not hide forever when there were those who dared to light a candle. That evening, taking advantage of the chaos as the family prepared to host an important business partner, Jonathan created an opportunity for Mercy to slip out of the house. He told her to go to the widow Mary Prescott's home, a place his father always avoided, considering her an eccentric who doesn't believe in God. Mercy carried with her the scraps of paper Jonathan had secretly taken from his father's study, scribbled notes about rituals and their corresponding financial blessings. And so, in the small attic of the widow Mary's house, the fateful meeting took place. Thomas Carver, invited by Mary after receiving an urgent message, sat opposite the gaunt servant girl, who carried within her a terrible secret. Under the candlelight, Mercy Hale sat on a wooden chair, her hands clasped together. Her voice was trembling but clear as she told a story of systematic abuse that made Thomas clench his fists to contain his anger. "How long has this been happening, child?" the widow Mary asked gently, her voice warm and full of compassion. Mercy's eyes, once clear and innocent, now held a heartbreaking maturity. "Since I started working there," she whispered. "They said the Bradford family carries a sacred burden, that their prosperity is a gift from God, but it must be protected." "Protected how?" Thomas probed carefully, trying not to frighten the girl. "With purity," Mercy continued, her voice taking on the mechanical cadence of someone reciting a memorized lesson. "Deacon Jacob says the innocence of young girls is the most powerful sacrifice to keep God's blessing from leaving them. We are the guardians of their prosperity, the instruments to maintain their wealth." Thomas's jaw tightened. He didn't need to be a pastor to know this was the most hideous blasphemy. He looked at the papers Mercy had just placed on the table. Jacob's scribbled notes, listing investments, successful land deals right after each ritual. This wasn't just talk. It was physical evidence, an accounting ledger of crime. The most disturbing part was what Mercy described next. She described the small scars on the girls' backs, made with a ritual knife, each scar symbolizing a blessing they had brought. Those scars, once healed, would be a permanent reminder of their duty. "There are others," Mercy said suddenly, her voice urgent as she looked directly at Thomas. "It's not just me. They kidnap girls from other towns, ones no one will look for. Esther, the new girl, will be next. The ritual happens on every new moon, when they believe the world's greed is at its weakest, and their prayers will be heard most clearly. She's still there, being held captive. Thomas Carver exchanged a meaningful look with the widow Mary. As a man from Boston, where Enlightenment ideas were stirring, he understood that to fight a power as entrenched as the Bradfords, compassion was not enough. It required careful strategy and irrefutable evidence. "I need to find a way into that house," he told Mary. "But first, I must better understand their standing in this town." Thomas's discreet inquiries in the following days painted a disturbing picture of complicit silence. The Bradford family, despite keeping their distance, was respected by the entire town. They were the main patrons of the church, owned most of the farmland, and Deacon Jacob's voice carried more weight than the village headman's. Local dignitaries spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and fear. "Deacon Jacob is the one who keeps our faith pure," a church council member explained to Thomas, his voice full of pride. "He protects us from the decadent ideas of the big cities." Thomas pressed further. "But I've heard that many servant girls have left suddenly. Surely people must find that strange." The man's expression hardened. "The Bradfords have very high standards. Girls who can't meet them have to leave. The deacon believes in maintaining an orderly and moral household. That is admirable." Thomas recognized the carefully chosen phrasing of someone who knew more than he dared to say. It was clear that the Bradfords' actions were an open secret, protected by a network of silence woven from fear, tradition, and economic dependence. His investigation led him to the town's old records, where he discovered a suspicious pattern stretching back for generations. Every time the Bradfords made a major land deal or had a bountiful harvest, a mysterious death would occur in their house shortly after, usually a young servant girl or a distant relative who had come to stay, recorded as dying from fever or an accident. The children born into the family also had an unusually high mortality rate. The most chilling discovery came when Thomas, with the help of an old clerk, found the journal of the family's founder, Jacob Bradford's great-grandfather. In it, he wrote of his sick belief that the family's prosperity had to be watered with innocence to keep the land fertile and business deals favorable. His descendants, clearly, had turned these mad superstitions into a sacred ritual. Meanwhile, at the Bradford estate, Deacon Jacob was growing restless. This year's harvest was not as expected, and an important business partner had just canceled a deal. The family's carefully maintained cloak of prosperity was beginning to show signs of wear. "It is due to a lack of faith," he growled during dinner, his sharp gaze sweeping over the family members. "The purity we offer is not strong enough. Our prayers have been tainted." He stared at Mercy, who was serving the table, his gaze making the girl shudder. "This girl's stubbornness is displeasing the Lord." Ruth Bradford, his sister, nodded in agreement. "She has become an obstacle to our blessing. The girl Esther is our hope now." That night, as the new moon cast a black shadow over Concord, the Bradford family gathered in the basement for a new ritual. Esther, the kidnapped 4-year-old, was brought out, her body trembling with fear. She was prepared for the ritual with the mechanical precision of a morbid routine, but they did not know that, outside, Thomas Carver and Jonah were hiding in the darkness of the trees, observing through a small crack in the basement window. Thomas had seen enough. He saw Jacob reciting twisted prayers, saw Samuel holding Esther down, saw the hesitation and fear on the faces of Jonathan and Daniel. He had Mercy's testimony, Jacob's notes, and now, first-hand evidence. But he knew that evidence alone would not be enough. The Bradfords' power was embedded in the very foundations of Concord. To overthrow them, he needed a bold plan. Returning to the widow Mary's house in the darkness, Thomas began to formulate a plan that would require all the cunning of a craftsman and the courage of a reformer. The Bradford family had hidden behind the cloak of faith for too long. It was time to rip that mask away, regardless of the consequences. Behind him, a deathly silence enveloped the Bradford estate, a testament to the evil being committed in the name of prosperity. But for the first time in generations, that crime had witnesses, and those witnesses would not be silent. The Concord Church Council convened a secret meeting the night after Thomas Carver officially submitted his accusations to the village headman. The meeting took place in a private room behind the sanctuary, under flickering candlelight, far from prying ears. Present were the most powerful men in town: village headman Elias Vance, who owned the largest mill, Justice of the Peace Gideon Finch, whose land bordered the Bradfords, and Deacon Jacob Bradford himself. Thomas Carver was not invited. "Gentlemen," Headman Vance began, his voice heavy with the weight of years of dependence, "we are facing a serious threat. These accusations from this Boston bookbinder, if they get out, will not only destroy the deacon's reputation, but also the stability of Concord." Justice Finch, a portly man whose fortune was tied to the Bradfords' generosity, leaned forward. "The Bradford family funds the church, the militia, and even this school. Their downfall would bring ruin to us all." Jacob Bradford sat silently, his expression like that of a martyr. "This is a trial from the Lord," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "The devil is using an outsider to attack the foundation of our faith." Headman Vance turned to Jacob. "But that servant girl, Mercy, she has escaped and is with the widow Prescott. Her words will spread. The girl is clearly suffering from delusions," Justice Finch declared with an air of authority. "Overwork and loneliness have made her sick. Her accusations are merely the product of a girl's weakness and imagination." Headman Vance nodded in agreement. "We must be united. This bookbinder is a radical from Boston, carrying foreign ideas. His word against all the respected men of this town will carry no weight. We will declare the girl Mercy to be possessed by demons, and Thomas Carver to be the one who led her astray." But even as the church council plotted to smother the truth, cracks were beginning to appear in the wall of silence they had so carefully constructed. That morning, a farming family had abruptly moved away, without giving a reason, leaving their fields half-tilled. Whispers spread through the taverns and the market, passed on by hired hands and neighbors who had long been suspicious of the Bradfords' unusual wealth. At the widow Mary's house, she cared for Mercy with a steely determination. The bruises on the girl's body were fading, but the terror in her eyes was deeper than any wound. In her calm moments, Mercy provided Thomas with increasingly horrific details about the Bradford family's rituals. "They keep records," she told Thomas one evening, her voice almost a whisper. "Deacon Jacob writes everything in a ledger. Which girl is chosen for the offering? What blessing is received afterward? Which child in the house shows signs of weak faith?" Thomas's pulse quickened. "Where does he keep this ledger?" "In the basement, behind the altar. There's a loose stone in the floor, and beneath it is a hollow where he keeps the most important things." Mercy's voice dropped even lower, trembling, and the small pieces of jewelry. Thomas's blood ran cold. "Jewelry?" "Yes. After each ritual, he takes a small item from the victim, a hairpin, a ribbon, a button, and puts it there. He says they are mementos of sacrifice, to ensure the blessing remains with the family." Thomas realized he was facing something far more systematic and pathological than he had imagined. The Bradford family wasn't just committing cruel acts. They were collecting trophies, preserving them as a gruesome collection of their crimes, a legacy of greed disguised as faith. That night, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Under the cover of darkness, he approached the Bradford estate with a small group of trusted allies, the widow Mary, who would stand watch outside, and Jonah, the former hired hand. Jonah's conscience had finally overcome his fear. "I can't let them harm another child," he had told Thomas earlier. "I have a niece Mercy's age. If we don't stop this, it will never end." The mansion loomed before them like a monument to greed, its upper windows dark, but a sickly light seeped from a crack in a basement window. They could hear a low chanting. Deacon Jacob was conducting one of his twisted rituals. Thomas felt his resolve harden as he heard the muffled sobs of a child. "The entrance is right behind the rose bush," Jonah whispered. "It leads directly to a short corridor that connects to the basement." They moved with stealth and skill. Jonah's experience with every nook and cranny of the house proved invaluable. The sounds from below grew louder as they approached. Jacob's voice raised in a perverted prayer, begging for blessings and prosperity. The whimpering of the victim, the rustle of clothes being pulled away. What they witnessed in that cellar would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The room was bizarrely arranged, half storeroom, half sanctuary, with a makeshift stone altar in the center. Charts of land and business contracts were hung on the walls, interspersed with Bible verses rewritten to justify greed. The girl Esther lay on the altar, her body exposed, and Ruth was preparing to use a small knife to carve a new scar on her back. Deacon Jacob stood over her, impeccably dressed but with a sick, fanatical gleam in his eyes. Around them, his sons stood watching. Samuel with an eager expression, Daniel trembling with fear, and Jonathan with his face turned away, unable to look. "In the name of the prosperity of our lineage," Jacob intoned, "we offer this purity as a sacrifice." Thomas had seen enough. He and Jonah burst into the room, their sudden appearance causing utter chaos. Jacob spun around, his face contorting with rage at the intrusion. "You worldly filth!" he screamed. "How dare you interrupt a sacred ritual? The only thing sacred here has been defiled by you," Thomas retorted, his voice steady despite the revulsion surrounding him. "This isn't prayer. This is a crime." Jonah rushed to cover Esther on the altar, pushing Ruth away. Meanwhile, Thomas quickly moved to the loose stone in the floor that Mercy had described, prying it up and grabbing the ledger and the small pieces of jewelry inside. But their victory was short-lived. From another door in the basement, Samuel Bradford and two large, loyal hired hands appeared. In their hands were cattle prods and clubs, crude but deadly weapons. "You will not destroy our legacy," Samuel roared, his face twisted with fanaticism and rage. "This prosperity must be protected." Jacob Bradford had gotten to his feet, his face red with fury. He signaled to the hired hands. "Seize them. They are thieves, blasphemers." As the two groups faced each other in the flickering candlelight, Thomas realized they had stumbled into a situation far more dangerous than anticipated. The Bradford family would do anything to protect their secrets and their wealth, and this basement could become a tomb for both him and Jonah. This unequal confrontation would determine not only the fate of Esther and Mercy, but the very soul of Concord itself. At that moment, a shout rang out from the stairs. Jonathan had run upstairs and knocked over a candelabra, starting a small fire that was enough to cause a commotion. He yelled, "Fire! The house is on fire," hoping to attract attention from outside. In the distance, a sudden winter thunderstorm began to roll in, the first clap of thunder rumbling over Concord, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for the coming judgment. The standoff in the basement was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Thomas Carver could feel the weight of generations of greed and superstition. The Bradford family's sin was manifest in the twisted faces surrounding them. Deacon Jacob had drawn himself up, cloaked in the authority of a man who believed he was executing God's will. "You understand nothing of our burden," Jacob hissed, his voice echoing in the confined space. "For nearly a century, the Bradford line has kept this land prosperous. We are the guardians of God's favor, the bulwark against poverty and failure." Jonah remained protectively in front of Esther, who lay curled up on the altar, her mind having retreated from the horror of reality. "This isn't protection," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. "This is the sacrifice of innocence for your greed." Ruth Bradford stepped out from the shadows, her face a mask of cold devotion. She was the Holy Mother in these rituals, the one who had psychologically manipulated Mercy and the other victims. "You speak of greed," she said, her voice as sharp as a razor, "but you know nothing of the curse of poverty that can befall this land. Our ancestors learned that the earth demands sacrifice to grant wealth. Only through continuous offerings can we keep this blessing." Jonah, who had watched his own mother work herself to exhaustion on the Bradford's land for a pittance, suddenly spoke. "I've seen sacrifice, ma'am. My mother sacrificed her health for this land. But what you do here, this isn't sacrificing for the land. This is you taking the lives of others and calling it a bountiful harvest." Jonah's words seemed to strike Ruth. For a moment, her fanatical expression cracked, revealing an emptiness within. Thomas glimpsed an unmarried woman who had spent her entire life serving her brother's madness, perhaps a victim herself of the very system she was defending, conditioned from childhood to believe this was the only way to survive. "That ledger," Jacob suddenly demanded, his sharp eyes fixed on Thomas's hand, which was clutching the ledger and the cloth bag of trinkets. "You will return it immediately. It is a record of God's blessings, not for the eyes of outsiders." "Blessings." The widow Mary, who had slipped in behind them, stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "I have lived my whole life in Concord and heard sermons about the Lord, and I can tell you that no blessing is bought with the tears of children. You have turned the church into a marketplace, and faith into an excuse for your greed." The confrontation was interrupted by a sound that chilled everyone to the bone. Jonathan's screams from upstairs. "Fire! The house is on fire. Help! The small fire Jonathan had started had begun to spread to an old rug. Smoke began to fill the air. Jacob Bradford realized he was losing control. The chaos would draw the townspeople. His secret was about to be exposed. "Seize them!" he screamed at Samuel and the hired hands. "Silence them before anyone comes." Something inside Thomas snapped. All his belief in reason and justice rebelled against this brazen brutality. Without thinking, he lunged forward, shoving Jacob with all his might. The deacon fell sprawling on the stone floor, the ledger flying from Thomas's hand. The action triggered chaos. Samuel roared and charged at Thomas with a club. Jonah, with the strength of a farmer, blocked the attack and grappled with Samuel. The two hired hands rushed Jonah, starting a fierce brawl. In the melee, the widow Mary quickly snatched up the ledger and the bag of trinkets, while Thomas wrestled with Jacob on the floor. The deacon fought with the desperate strength of a man whose empire was crumbling, his fingers clawing at Thomas's face. "You don't understand," Jacob rasped, choking on smoke and madness. "Without the sacrifice, the land will go barren. Famine will consume us all." Thomas managed to pin the older man down, his face inches from Jacob's wild eyes. "The only curse here is your greed. The only famine is the one you have sown in the souls of these children." At that moment, the basement door burst open. A few villagers carrying buckets of water, drawn by Jonathan's shouts, rushed in. They froze, horrified at the scene before them, their respected deacon wrestling on the floor, the basement filled with smoke, a young girl cowering on an altar, and a violent brawl in progress. The mask of the Bradford family had been ripped away. As the fight subsided under the horrified gazes of the villagers, the true scale of the Bradford family's crimes began to emerge. Behind a false wall in the basement, they discovered a hidden room where Esther had been held captive. Inside, a wooden chest contained evidence of systematic abuse, stretching back for generations. The ledger Thomas had seized was only the tip of the iceberg. This chest held older ledgers, detailing offerings and blessings from the time of Jacob's great-grandfather. The most disturbing discovery was an overgrown corner of the garden behind the mansion, where there were numerous unmarked mounds of earth. Jonah, with a rising dread, pointed at them. "This is where they bury the girls who don't survive," he said, his voice cracking. "They'd say it was a fever, but no one was allowed near." Each mound was marked only by a single stone, as if their very existence could be so easily erased. As dawn broke over Concord, the full magnitude of the Bradford family's crimes became clear. Thomas stood in the basement, now illuminated by the torches of curious villagers, and looked at the evidence they had gathered. The ledger and the victim's trinkets alone were enough to condemn Jacob, but he knew that justice would not come easily. The village headman and Justice Finch had quickly arrived, trying to control the situation and calm the crowd. Too many people in Concord had benefited from the Bradfords' prosperity. Too many reputations and economic interests were at stake for the truth to be exposed without a fight. "What now?" asked the widow Mary, holding Esther, who was still trembling, in her arms. Thomas looked at Mercy, who stood beside him, strong but with a lingering pain in her eyes. Then he looked at the Bradford sons. Jonathan, guilt-ridden, Daniel, terrified, and Samuel, bound and still glaring with defiance. They were all products of a sick system, and it would take a long time to heal, if ever. "Now we make sure everyone knows the truth," he said grimly. "We have the ledger, we have the testimony. We cannot let them bury this story the way they buried those anonymous victims." But even as he spoke, Thomas could see Headman Vance and Justice Finch whispering to each other in a corner, their eyes on the detained Jacob Bradford. They were beginning the process of damage control, of turning this into a tragic misunderstanding or an act of individual madness to protect the town's power structure. The real battle was just beginning, and it would not be decided by fists in a basement, but by words and influence in closed-door meetings. The outcome would determine whether justice would be served or whether the conspiracy of silence would once again prevail. In the distance, the church bells began to toll, signaling a new day. But today, their bronze voices no longer rang with peace, but like a dirge for lost innocence and an evil cloaked in piety, finally exposed to the morning light. The unofficial hearing took place 3 days after the raid, not in a courthouse, but in the main sanctuary of the Concord Church. The cover-up machine had been set in motion perfectly. Justice of the Peace, Gideon Finch, with the counsel of Jacob Bradford, had reframed the entire incident as an attack on a devout family by an outsider from Boston. Thomas Carver stood in the middle of the church, surrounded by the hostile faces of the town council. The evidence he had gathered, the ledger, the cloth bag of victims' trinkets, and Mercy's recorded testimony was laid on a table like accusations no one wanted to hear. "Mr. Thomas Carver," Justice Finch began, his voice echoing with false authority, "you are accused of breaking and entering, assaulting a respected deacon, and slandering a model family. How do you answer these charges?" "I answer that I stopped the abuse and imprisonment of children," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his boiling anger. "Everything else is secondary to that fact." Village Headman Vance leaned forward, attempting a sympathetic tone. "Mr. Carver, we understand the passions of youth, but surely you can see that your radical ideas from Boston have colored your interpretation of our traditional religious customs." The crowd of town dignitaries murmured in agreement. Thomas realized with horror that this entire community was prepared to sacrifice Mercy and Esther to protect their own stability and economic interests. The bonds of land and money that tied them to the Bradfords were stronger than any call for justice. "And what of this ledger?" he demanded, pointing to the damning evidence. "What of these items, these keepsakes from the victims? How do you explain the physical proof of systematic crime?" Deacon Jacob Bradford, looking like a martyr, rose to his feet. "Those are records of God's blessings and mementos of devotion," he said calmly. "Our rituals may seem strange to outsiders, but they are the sacred heritage of our clan. As for the scars Miss Mercy described, young, fanciful girls often injure themselves to seek attention." Thomas felt the ground crumble beneath him. They were rewriting reality right before his eyes, turning evidence of crime into religious heritage and a victim's wounds into delusion. "And Mercy's testimony?" he pressed. She described in detail what happened. Justice Finch's expression did not change. "Miss Mercy Hale has been examined and found to be suffering from delusions and exhaustion. Her testimony is unreliable. We believe that you, with your foreign ideas, have poisoned her young mind." The person who examined Mercy was an old village woman who survived on the Bradfords' patronage. Thomas understood that he was not just fighting the greed of one family, but an entire system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Jonah, who had bravely burst into the basement, now sat silently in a corner, his head bowed. When their eyes met, Jonah looked away, his face a mask of shame and fear. Thomas realized that Jonah's family had been threatened. He had lost. "The colonial authorities in Boston will want to investigate this," Thomas said, playing his last card. "The girl Esther has been returned to her distant relatives," Headman Vance announced smoothly. "As for Mercy, for her own good, she will be sent to a farm in the west, where she can work and recover in the fresh air, away from bad influences." Thomas's blood ran cold. That farm was undoubtedly controlled by an ally of the Bradfords, where Mercy would be isolated and her story buried forever. "You're going to let them get away with it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We are going to protect this community from slander and outside interference," Justice Finch replied. "The Bradford family has graciously agreed to overlook this offense. They will continue to live and worship God here, as they always have." The final insult. The Bradford family was not only unpunished, but praised for their forgiveness. Thomas realized he was witnessing how power and money could distort truth, turning crime into virtue and justice into a farce. As the hearing concluded, Thomas Carver was officially banished from Concord and threatened with arrest if he ever returned. His reputation among craftsmen was ruined by rumors of a troublemaking radical. But as he prepared to leave town in defeat, Thomas had an unexpected visitor. The widow Mary Prescott appeared at the door of his inn, her face grim with unshakable resolve. "I have sent a letter to a friend in Pennsylvania," she said without preamble. "They are Mennonites. They do not believe in the authority of the church or local government. They only believe in what is right." Thomas felt a spark of hope. "What are you suggesting?" "We cannot win here," she said, "but we can save the girl. Jonathan has agreed to help us get Mercy away before they can send her off." "We cannot defeat the Bradfords with Concord's laws," the widow Mary said, her voice firm, "but we can get Mercy to safety. and we can expose the rot that protects families like them. She handed Thomas a careful, handwritten copy of the most important pages from the ledger, which she had made during the night. I have also written a letter telling the whole story. I will send it to a cousin who works for a printer in Boston. They are willing to print sensational stories as long as we have proof. Thomas studied the pages, his mind racing with possibilities. The town council could control everything in Concord, but they could not control the printing presses in Boston. If this story was spread, it could warn other communities about similar model families. And Mercy, he asked, will she be safe? She has agreed to go, Mary replied. She understands that her silence would be a death sentence for other girls. Her story, even if told through an anonymous print, could save many lives. That night, with Jonathan's help, Mercy escaped from Concord. As Thomas prepared to leave the next morning, he could see the Bradford estate in the distance, still standing tall, a symbol of power and deceit. The Bradford family had won. They kept their wealth, their reputation, and continued their crimes in secret. But for the first time since coming to Concord, Thomas felt something other than helplessness. The battle for justice was lost in Concord, but the larger war was far from over. In the spreading ideas of the Enlightenment, he had found allies who understood that superstition and the abuse of power, whether in the name of religion or tradition, were a form of bondage. The Bradford family may have escaped local punishment, but they would not escape the judgment of the printed word. As his carriage rolled away from Concord, Thomas began to draft the preface to the account he would send to the printer. Mercy's story would not be forgotten, and the suffering of the anonymous victims would no longer be in vain. A year after the events in Concord, a thin, anonymously printed pamphlet caused a quiet storm in the coffeehouses and drawing rooms of Boston. It was titled "The Curse Beneath the Mask," a testimony from Concord, and it became one of the most talked about publications of 1755. Written by Thomas Carver, it recounted Mercy's story in detail without using real names, exposing the crimes disguised by faith and prosperity. The story sparked outrage, disbelief, and a fierce debate about the limits of family authority and the abuse of religion. Pastors from the pulpit condemned it as a work of blasphemy, while Enlightenment thinkers praised it as a wake-up call. Mercy Hale, now 16, lived in a peaceful Mennonite community in Pennsylvania. Her once damaged spirit had now found peace, but it had also been tempered into a quiet resolve. The months of healing had been difficult, but she had found strength in helping the other orphan children in the community. Her story, though told anonymously, had become a testament to survival and courage. Thomas Carver, despite facing numerous threats and being ostracized by conservatives, continued his work. He did not stand before crowds, but he stood behind the written word. In the preface to the pamphlet, he wrote, "We write these lines not to slander one family, but to confront a truth our society often ignores, that greed can wear the cloak of faith, and cruelty can flourish in the shadows of the most respected homes, protected by wealth, tradition, and a conspiracy of silence." The readers listened. They read about the systematic nature of the Bradford family's crimes, about the generations of abuse justified by superstition, and about the efforts of an entire town to bury the truth. But Thomas's real target was larger than one family or one town. He wrote, "The same mindset that believes one person can own another is the same mindset that believes one person can be sacrificed for another's benefit. Whether in the name of skin color or in the name of a blessing, it is based on the principle that some lives are considered less valuable than others. Both hide behind claims of tradition and natural order." After the pamphlet was published, Thomas began to receive anonymous letters from across the colonies, telling of similar cases. Powerful families with dark secrets, protected by the same combination of money, influence, and willful ignorance. This network of complicity was much larger than he had ever imagined. The Bradford family themselves remained in Concord, insulated by their power and wealth. They simply changed their methods. Instead of kidnapping, they now adopted orphans from poor districts, promising a better life. The local authorities, bound by self-interest, praised their charity and warned citizens not to believe the malicious slander in an anonymous book. "The girl we failed to save in Concord," Thomas wrote in a subsequent publication, "represents countless other children suffering in silence across the colonies. They are the hidden victims of a system that values property over souls, that protects the rich at the expense of the poor. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, Mercy Hale, now able to read and write fluently thanks to the help of the Mennonite community, had read Thomas's pamphlet. For the first time, she saw her story written down, her pain acknowledged. She did not stand before a crowd, but she had found her own voice. She began to write letters. "My name is Mercy Hale," she wrote in a letter to a small Quaker newspaper who shared a similar ideology against oppression. "I am 17 years old, and I am a survivor of what my former master called an offering for prosperity, but what the world must recognize as abuse and torture in the name of greed." Her testimony, written with painful precision, had a different kind of power. She described the basement, the twisted logic that justified sacrifice, and the ledger of crime. But most importantly, she wrote about the other children who were still trapped in similar respectable families. "They told us our sacrifice was necessary," she wrote. "They told us our pain would bring wealth, but I have learned that the only thing necessary is for someone to dare to speak the truth, even if only on a page, when they witness evil." The reaction to Thomas's and Mercy's writings was immediate and polarizing. Supporters hailed them as a wake-up call to the corruption hidden behind respectable facades. Critics, especially wealthy landowners and the pastors they sponsored, condemned them as an attack on the social order and family autonomy, arguing that interference in private matters was a dangerous precedent. The written word had taken on a life of its own. Similar stories began to emerge, retold in letters and at the quiet meetings of Quakers and other progressive groups. The Concord case became a symbol of the larger struggle between the power of the landed gentry and the emerging concept of human dignity. The widow Mary, who had become a patron for many orphan children, turned her home into a safe way station for servants fleeing abusive households. The work was dangerous. Her house was once stoned by an angry mob defending order and tradition, but it offered hope to those who previously had nowhere to turn. Thomas Carver's bookbinding shop evolved into something of an underground press, specializing in publishing writings that exposed injustice. His work attracted other thinkers, creating a quiet network of information exchange that helped shape the debates on human rights in the years to come. But progress came at a price. Thomas frequently received threats. His shop was vandalized. The forces protecting the abuse of power were as determined as those who benefited from it, and they would not give up their privileges without a fight. On a cold November evening in 1756, as snow began to fall on the cobbled streets of Philadelphia, Thomas sat in his study, reading the latest reports from their network of contacts. The Bradford family in Concord continued their charitable activities, their power seemingly unshaken. Local authorities still ignored all calls for investigation, citing respect for family privacy. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Mercy, now a strong and poised 7-year-old, entered. She carried a letter brought by a special courier. Her face was serious but determined as she handed him the envelope. "It's from Jonathan Bradford," she said quietly. "He has left Concord." Thomas opened the letter with trembling hands, reading Jonathan's desperate warning. He had fled his family after being unable to bear the guilt any longer, but he had not gone alone. He had taken with him Daniel, his shy younger brother, who was also horrified by the rituals. "He is asking for our help," Mercy continued, "but he is also warning us. His father is not just continuing the rituals, he has allied with other wealthy families in the region who share the same sick beliefs. They are forming a secret society, a covenant of prosperity, to protect and expand their activities, ensuring that the blessings will never run out." Thomas Carver felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. The Concord case had been just the beginning, a glimpse into a network of greed and superstition that stretched across the colonies. The battle they had fought in the Bradford mansion was part of a much larger war, one that would require all their cunning and determination to win. As he prepared to write a reply to Jonathan, Thomas reflected on the strange parallels between his struggle and the growing voices against injustice in the colonies. Both were fighting against systems that treated human beings as instruments. Both faced violent opposition from entrenched interests, and both required the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. The legacy of abuse from the Bradford family and their covenant of prosperity might continue, protected by silence and complicity. But their victims now had a voice, and those voices, though quiet, were spreading with every pamphlet, every letter. The judgment that began in a basement in Concord would eventually reach the conscience of society, forcing it to confront truths that had been hidden for too long. In the distance, the church bells began to toll midnight. Their bronze voices echoed across Philadelphia like a promise of justice, delayed but not denied. The fight for the vulnerable would continue, one rescue at a time, one testimony at a time, until the conspiracy of silence was finally broken forever. The curse beneath the mask of the Bradford family had been exposed, but the work of healing and lighting the lamp of reason had just begun. In the growing darkness of a land on the verge of rebellion against oppression, the battle for human dignity would be fought on many fronts, and children like Mercy would not be forgotten.